Sometimes when life knocks you down, you discover strength you never knew you had. Sometimes the place that feels like the end of your dreams becomes the beginning of something beautiful. Jack Mercer thought inheriting his uncle's rundown farmhouse was just another burden. The neighbors called it worthless, the roof leaked and the barn was falling apart, but his 11-year-old son Eli saw something different. While exploring the old barn, Eli found a hidden hatch under the rotting floor. What he discovered underneath changed their lives forever. 140 vintage tractors sat waiting in the darkness, each one holding a piece of forgotten history. These weren't just old machines, they were somebody's treasure, carefully hidden away for reasons nobody understood. What would drive someone to hide an entire collection like this? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moving truck had long since disappeared down the winding gravel road, leaving behind nothing but dust and the echo of diesel fumes hanging in the Oregon mountain air. Jack Mercer stood on the sagging front porch of what was now supposed to be home, watching his 11-year-old son Eli pick his way carefully through the overgrown yard like he was navigating a minefield of memories neither of them wanted to step on. 6 months ago, Jack had been pulling down 6 figures as a project. Manager for a tech startup in Portland, he'd had a corner office with a view of Mount Hood, a company car, and enough confidence to believe that success was something you earned and kept through hard work and smart decisions. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, his job was gone, another casualty of market corrections and investor panic that swept through Silicon Valley like wildfire. The farmhouse looked exactly like something you'd inherit when you'd rather inherit nothing at all. The roof sagged in 3 different directions, as if it couldn't decide which way to give up first. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips that fluttered in the mountain breeze like prayer flags for lost causes. Windows stared out from the structure with the vacant expression of a man who'd given up hope years ago. "Dad, there's a bird living in the kitchen," Eli called from somewhere inside the house, his voice carrying that particular tone of acceptance that children use when they've learned to expect disappointment. Jack stepped through the front door and immediately understood what his son meant. A barn swallow had built its nest in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, apparently considering the gap in the roof more feature than flaw. The bird regarded them both with the territorial confidence of a landlord who'd been collecting rent in the form of silence and solitude. "Well," Jack said, setting down the box he'd been carrying, "I guess we're not the only ones who needed a place to start over." The kitchen hadn't seen use in years, maybe decades. The refrigerator hummed with the labored breathing of a machine on life support. Linoleum curled up at the edges like old photographs, revealing patches of subflooring that had seen better decades. But the bones of the place were solid. Thick wooden beams that had been hewn by hand, foundation stones that had held firm through countless Oregon winters. Eli wandered through the rooms with the careful attention he gave to everything, a habit Jack had noticed developing since the divorce 2 years earlier. His son had always been observant, but losing his mother to a custody battle that felt more like a business negotiation had turned observation into a survival skill. Eli noticed things other people missed, the way conversations ended when he entered a room, the difference between a real smile and the kind adults used when they were trying to protect you from truth. "There's pictures on the mantel," Eli said from the living room. "Old ones." Jack found his son studying a collection of faded photographs arranged on the stone fireplace mantel like artifacts in a museum dedicated to someone else's life. The largest frame held a black and white image of a young man standing next to what looked like a 1940s tractor, his hand resting on the hood with the easy familiarity of someone who understood machinery better than people. "That's got to be Uncle Raymond," Jack said, though he'd only met his father's brother a handful of times. Family gatherings had been rare in the Mercer household, and Raymond had always seemed like more myth than relative. The brother who'd chosen dirt roads over city streets, who'd never married, never had children, never seemed to want anything more than whatever he'd found in these Oregon hills. The photograph showed Raymond as a man maybe 30 years old, lean and strong, with eyes that held the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were meant to do with your life. Jack felt a pang of something that might have been envy. He couldn't remember ever feeling that certain about anything. "He looks like you," Eli said. "You think? Same nose, same way of standing with your hands in your pockets when you're thinking about something." Jack looked closer at the photograph and realized his son was right. The resemblance was there in the jawline, in the way Raymond's shoulders set, in something around the eyes that suggested both stubbornness and kindness in equal measure. Other photographs showed Raymond at different ages, working on engines, standing with groups of men beside various pieces of farm equipment, accepting some kind of certificate from officials in suits. In every picture, he had the look of a man who'd found his purpose and never wavered from it. "Why didn't we ever visit him?" Eli asked. It was a fair question, and one Jack wasn't sure he could answer honestly. His father had always spoken about Raymond with a mixture of affection and frustration, as if his younger brother had chosen to live in a different century. "Your uncle's got his own way of doing things," his father used to say, which was family code for, "We don't understand each other, but we've agreed to pretend that's fine." "I think maybe they had different ideas about what mattered," Jack said finally. The afternoon stretched long as they explored their inheritance. The farmhouse sat on 47 acres of rolling hills and dense forest, land that would have been worth a fortune if it had been anywhere near civilization. But out here, 2 hours from the nearest real town, surrounded by neighbors who measured distance in mountain ridges rather than city blocks, it felt more like exile than opportunity. The barn stood about 50 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Like everything else on the property, it had the look of something that had been well built once and then forgotten. The large doors hung slightly askew on hinges that protested with rusty squeaks when Jack pushed them open. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through gaps in the board siding. The smell was all hay and motor oil and time. Not unpleasant, but heavy with the weight of years. Farm equipment sat covered by tarps and dust. A small plow, some kind of cedar. Tools whose purposes Jack could only guess at. Everything looked like it had been carefully arranged and then abandoned, as if Raymond had stepped out for lunch one day and never returned. "Dad, look at this!" Eli was crouched in the far corner of the barn, running his hands along what looked like a trapdoor set into the floor. The wood was warped and stained, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Jack knelt beside his son and saw what had caught Eli's attention. The outline of a hatch, maybe 4 feet square, with an iron ring set flush into the wood. It looked heavy, deliberately hidden beneath decades of dust and scattered hay. "You think it goes to a root cellar?" Eli asked. "Maybe." Jack grasped the iron ring and pulled. The hatch didn't budge. He tried again, putting his back into it, and felt the wood give slightly. On the third attempt, with Eli helping to clear away debris, the trapdoor lifted with a groan of protest that echoed through the barn like the sound of something ancient waking up. Cool air rose from the darkness below, carrying scents of earth and metal and something else, something that suggested secrets kept and promises honored. Jack pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight app, sending a cone of white light down into the space beneath the barn. What he saw made him forget for a moment how to breathe. The underground chamber stretched out beyond the reach of his phone's light, filled with shapes that resolved slowly into recognition. Tractors. Dozens of them. Maybe more than dozens. They sat in neat rows like sleeping giants, some covered by tarps, others gleaming dully in the artificial light. Different sizes, different eras, different colors, a museum of American agriculture hidden beneath a barn that everyone assumed held nothing more interesting than old hay and rusted tools. "Holy cow," Eli whispered. Jack couldn't find words. He counted what he could see in the narrow beam of light. 10, 20, 30 machines, and the chamber extended beyond what the phone's light could reveal. Each tractor looked like it had been carefully positioned, lovingly preserved, protected from weather and time and the outside world that had apparently forgotten they existed. "Why would Uncle Raymond hide all this?" Eli asked. It was the same question that had been forming in Jack's mind, but hearing it spoken aloud made the mystery feel larger, more significant. This wasn't just a collection, it was a statement, a commitment, a man's life work hidden away like treasure, waiting for someone to discover it and ask exactly the question his son had just asked. Jack climbed down into the chamber, his feet finding wooden rungs built into the wall. The space was larger than the barn above it, extending in both directions beyond what he could see. The air was cool and dry, perfect for preservation. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this hidden sanctuary. "Come on down," he called to Eli. "Carefully." His son descended the ladder with the fearless curiosity that came naturally to 11-year-old boys, even 11-year-old boys who'd learned to be cautious about getting their hopes up. Together, they walked between the rows of tractors, Jack's phone light revealing details that made the mystery deeper with every step. These weren't just old machines. They were classics, carefully maintained examples of American farm equipment. From across decades of agricultural history, a red Farmhouse that looked like it rolled off the line in the 1940s, a green John Deere from what might have been the 1950s, yellow Minneapolis Molinas, and orange Alices and blue Fords, each one representing a different era of American farming. "There's got to be more than 100 of them," Eli said, his voice hushed with wonder. Jack was beginning to think his son was right. The chamber seemed to go on forever, filled with iron and steel and the dreams of men who'd built their lives, around the rhythm of seasons and the promise of harvest. Uncle Raymond hadn't just collected these machines. He'd preserved them, protected them, created a sanctuary for pieces of history that the outside world had apparently decided weren't worth saving. As they walked deeper into the collection, Jack's phone light caught something else. A small wooden desk, pushed up against the far wall, its surface covered with notebooks and papers. Above it, tacked to a wooden beam, was another photograph. Raymond as an older man, standing in this very chamber, surrounded by tractors, wearing an expression of deep satisfaction. On the desk, a leather-bound notebook lay open to a page covered with Raymond's careful handwriting. Jack picked it up and read the first entry, June 15th, 1962. "Saved the old Farmhouse today. Johnson was going to sell it for scrap, but these machines deserve better. They built this country. They fed this nation. Someone ought to remember that." Jack looked up from the notebook to find Eli watching him with those observant eyes that missed nothing. "I think Uncle Raymond was trying to save them," Jack said quietly. "Save them from what?" "From being forgotten." Above them, the barn swallow called from its nest in the kitchen, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once and fell silent. The mountain air was growing cold as evening approached, and Jack realized they'd spent hours exploring their inheritance without even thinking about dinner or unpacking or any of the practical concerns that came with starting over in a place where nothing was familiar. But as he stood in that hidden chamber, surrounded by machines that someone had loved enough to preserve, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of possibility. Uncle Raymond had left them more than a run-down farmhouse and 47 acres of Oregon wilderness. He'd left them a mystery, a mission, and maybe, if they were lucky, a reason to believe that sometimes the things that look worthless on the surface hold treasures that can change everything. The brass key felt warm in Jack's palm, worn smooth by decades of use. He'd found it hanging on a small hook beside Raymond's desk, attached to a simple leather fob with "Old Blue" carved into it in careful block letters. The key seemed to pulse with possibility, as if it held not just the power, To start an engine, but to unlock something larger, a connection to the past that Jack had never known he was missing. "Think it still works?" Eli asked, running his hand along the hood of the 1947 John Deere Model A they'd identified as Old Blue from the careful notes in Raymond's ledger. The tractor sat in the front row of the underground collection, positioned like the flagship of Raymond's hidden fleet. Its green paint had faded to a soft sage color, but the chrome still gleamed, and the seat leather, though cracked with age, looked like it had been carefully maintained. Unlike some of the other machines in the chamber, this one showed signs of recent attention: oil changes, greased fittings, protective covers over the air intake. Jack climbed up onto the metal seat, the springs creaking under his weight. The steering wheel was larger than what you'd find on a modern tractor, designed for an era when farming required more muscle and patience than hydraulics and GPS. He slipped the key into the ignition and paused, suddenly aware that he was about to wake something that had been sleeping for who knew how long. "You sure about this, Dad?" Eli had moved to the front of the tractor, standing clear of the path but close enough to see everything. "Not at all," Jack admitted, but he turned the key anyway. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a rumble that filled the underground chamber like thunder. Blue smoke coughed from the exhaust stack as the diesel engine settled into a steady rhythm that spoke of careful maintenance and quality engineering. The sound was deeper, more substantial than modern equipment, the heartbeat of an era when machines were built to last generations rather than fiscal quarters. "It sounds like it's purring," Eli said, his eyes wide with wonder. Jack sat in the operator's seat, feeling the gentle vibration of the engine through the metal frame, and understood, for the first time, why Raymond might have spent his life preserving these machines. There was something alive about Old Blue, something that connected the man operating it to the soil beneath the wheels, to the seasons that governed planting and harvest, to a way of life that measured success in acres covered and crops brought. In rather than quarterly earnings reports, he let the engine run for a few minutes, listening to its steady rhythm, before turning the key to shut it down. The silence that followed felt profound, as if they'd just witnessed something sacred returning. "To sleep. Dad, look at this." Eli had wandered deeper into the chamber, while Jack had been absorbed in his mechanical meditation. His son stood beside a workbench that Jack hadn't noticed before, holding what looked like a hand-drawn map. Jack climbed down from the tractor and joined his son at the bench. The map was drawn on heavy paper in Raymond's careful handwriting, showing what appeared to be the local area, with various locations marked by small X's. Numbers beside each mark corresponded to a legend at the bottom: Site 7, Morrison Barn, 12 machines. Site 12, Hendricks Property, 8 machines. Site 15, Old Peterson Place, 22 machines. "There are more," Eli said quietly. "A lot more." Jack counted the marked locations on the map. 18 sites scattered across 3 counties, each one apparently aiding additional pieces of Raymond's collection. If the numbers were accurate, they were looking at more than just the 140 machines in this chamber. They were looking at a network of preservation that covered hundreds of square miles and possibly thousands of pieces of agricultural history. Why would he spread them out like this? Jack wondered aloud. Maybe he didn't want anyone to find all of them at once, Eli suggested, with the logical thinking that had always impressed his father. Like hiding your money in different banks. The comparison was apt, Jack realized. These tractors were worth money, potentially a lot of money to the right collectors. But looking at Raymond's careful notations, reading the detailed descriptions of each machine's condition and history, Jack got the impression that his uncle had been motivated by something more than financial investment. On the workbench beside the map lay several manila folders, each one labeled with a year and filled with what appeared to be correspondence. Jack opened the one marked 1963 and found letters from farmers, auction houses, scrap dealers, and equipment manufacturers. The common thread seemed to be Raymond's efforts to acquire machines that were destined for the scrapyard. One letter, Typed on letterhead from a farm equipment dealer in Eugene caught Jack's attention. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate your interest in the old Farmhouse, but I must point out that the scrap value exceeds what you're offering by nearly 30%. These old machines aren't worth saving. The new models are more efficient, more reliable, and come with factory warranties. I can't justify selling to you when Anderson Scrap will take the whole lot off my hands tomorrow." Raymond's handwritten response was clipped to the back of the letter. "Mr. Daniels, I understand your position, but I hope you'll reconsider. These machines represent more than scrap value. They're pieces of American history, examples of engineering and craftsmanship that we'll never see again. I'm not asking you to take a loss, only to consider that some things are worth more than their weight in steel. If you change your mind, my offer stands." The folder contained dozens of similar exchanges, a record of Raymond's patient campaign to save machines that the agricultural world had decided were obsolete. Some letters showed success, grateful farmers happy to see their old equipment go to someone who appreciated its value. Others documented failures, machines lost to scrapyards because Raymond couldn't match the price of processed steel. He was fighting a war, Jack said, more to himself than to Eli. What kind of war? Against forgetting, against throwing away things just because they're old. Jack opened another folder, this one marked 1975, and found photographs along with the correspondence. Black and white images showed Raymond with various collaborators, farmers, mechanics, other collectors who apparently shared his passion for preservation. In one photo, he stood with a group of men beside what looked like a vintage steam tractor, all of them wearing expressions of deep satisfaction. The photographs told the story of a community that had grown up around Raymond's mission. Men who understood that the machines they'd grown up with deserved better than the scrapyard. Veterans who'd returned from war to find the equipment of their childhood being replaced by newer, more efficient models that lacked the character and craftsmanship of earlier generations. "Look at this," Eli said, pointing to a newspaper clipping tucked into the back of the folder. The article from the Salem Statesman Journal and dated July 15, 1976, featured a headline that read, "Local Man Preserves Agricultural History." The accompanying photograph showed Raymond standing in front of a barn with several restored tractors visible in the background. The article described Raymond as a quiet crusader for American agricultural heritage, who had spent 15 years collecting and restoring vintage farm equipment. The reporter noted that Raymond's collection included machines from every major manufacturer and spanning nearly 50 years of technological development. "These machines built America," Mercer said during a recent interview. "They fed a growing nation, won wars, and turned wilderness into farmland. They deserve better than the scrapyard." Jack felt a strange pride reading about his uncle's mission, mixed with regret that he'd never known about it while Raymond was alive. The man described in the newspaper article was nothing like the distant, eccentric figure his father had always portrayed. This Raymond was passionate, dedicated, visionary, someone who'd seen value where others saw only obsolescence. "Dad, there's more stuff over here." Eli had moved to another section of the workbench, where additional folders and documents were stacked in neat piles. Among them was a ledger bound in dark leather, its pages filled with Raymond's careful handwriting. Jack opened the ledger to the first page and found an entry dated June 1, 1961. "Started the collection today with the old Farmhouse H that Johnson was going to scrap. Paid him $50 more than the scrap dealer offered, and he threw in the cultivator and the old plow. The tractor needs work, but the engine is sound and the hydraulics still function. With care, she'll run another 50 years. Someone should remember what built this country." Page after page documented similar acquisitions, tractors saved from scrapyards, restored to working condition, carefully catalogued and preserved. Raymond had recorded not just the mechanical details of each machine, but its history, who had owned it, what farms it had worked, what crops it had planted and harvested. Over decades of faithful service, the ledger revealed the full scope of Raymond's passion project. By Jack's rough count, his uncle had preserved more than 800 pieces of equipment over 4 decades, not just tractors, but plows, harvesters, cultivators, and dozens of other implements that had once been the backbone of American agriculture. "This is incredible," Jack said, flipping through pages that documented a lifetime of dedicated collecting. "He saved all of this. But why hide it?" Eli asked. "If he was proud of it, why not show it off?" It was a good question, and one that Jack couldn't answer from the documents he'd found so far. The newspaper articles suggested that Raymond had been willing to talk about his collection, at least in the 1970s, but something had changed, some reason that had driven him to secrecy, to hiding his life's work beneath barns and in forgotten corners of rural Oregon. Jack closed the ledger and looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't just a collection, it was a museum, a library, a shrine to a way of life that had largely disappeared from modern America. Raymond had spent 40 years fighting to preserve something that most people considered worthless, and he'd done it with the patience and dedication of someone who truly believed in the importance of his mission. The brass key still rested in Jack's palm, warm from his grip. He looked at Old Blue, sitting quietly in the front row of Raymond's preserved fleet, and felt the weight of inheritance in a way he'd never experienced before. This wasn't just property he'd inherited, it was responsibility, a mission that Raymond had spent his life pursuing and had somehow passed along to a nephew he barely knew. "What do we do with all this?" Eli asked, echoing the question that was forming in Jack's mind. Jack looked at his son, this quiet, observant boy who'd discovered the hidden chamber, who'd asked the right questions, who'd shown more curiosity about their strange inheritance than fear or confusion, and realized that maybe they'd both inherited more than old tractors and mysterious maps. "I think," Jack said slowly, "we figure out what Uncle Raymond was really trying to do, and then maybe we help him finish it." Above them, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the barn floor. Soon they'd need to head back to the house, to figure out dinner and unpack their boxes, and deal with all the practical concerns of starting over in a place that still felt more like exile than opportunity. But for now, they stood in Raymond's hidden sanctuary, surrounded by the mechanical ghosts of American agriculture, holding a key that could start engines and unlock mysteries, and maybe, if they were brave enough to turn it, change their lives forever. The journal entry was dated March 15th, 1943, written in Raymond's careful script on paper that had yellowed with age. Jack found it tucked inside the operator's manual for a 1940 Alice Chalmers, as if his uncle had been using it as a bookmark and simply forgotten it was there. "Today they came for the Hendricks boys' tractor," Raymond had written, said it was needed for the war effort, that the steel would help build tanks and ships to fight the Nazis. "I understand the need, but I watched that machine being loaded onto the scrap truck and felt like we were losing part of ourselves. These tractors are the iron horses of America's backbone. Someone ought to save a few for the future, so people remember what built this country." Jack read the entry aloud to Eli, who was sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor of the chamber, carefully cataloguing the serial numbers of nearby tractors in a notebook he'd found among Raymond's supplies. The boy had taken to the task with the methodical patience he brought to everything, treating each machine like an artifact worthy of documentation. "He was just 23 when he wrote this," Jack said, checking the math in his head. "Younger than I was when you were born." "What made him think about saving them?" Eli asked, not looking up from his careful notation of a 1941 Farmhouse A's identification numbers. "I think he saw what was coming," Jack said, settling onto an overturned crate beside his son. "The war changed everything, not just because of what got scrapped for metal, but because farming changed after that. Bigger machines, more efficient operations, family farms giving way to corporate agriculture. They'd been spending every morning in the chamber for the past week, slowly working their way through Raymond's collection and the documentation that accompanied it. Jack had found journals and notebooks scattered throughout the space, tucked into toolboxes and wrapped in oilcloth, each one offering glimpses into his uncle's 4-decade mission to preserve agricultural history. The earliest entries revealed a young man grappling with changes he could see coming but couldn't stop. Raymond had grown up on his family's farm, watching his father work the same fields with the same equipment year after year, but the war had accelerated everything. New technologies, new methods, new ways of thinking about land and productivity that made the old machines seem as obsolete as oxen. "Listen to this," Jack said, opening another journal to a random page. July 4th, 1947. Bought the old John Deere Model B from Peterson today. He said it was getting too expensive to maintain, that the new models were more reliable. Maybe so, but that tractor helped him pay off his farm after the Depression. Seems wrong to just throw it away because something newer came along. Eli finished writing and looked up at his father. "Did Uncle Raymond ever get married? Have kids?" "I don't think so. Your grandfather used to say Raymond was married to his tractors." Jack had meant it as a light comment, but reading his uncle's journals was giving him a different perspective on what his father had probably seen as eccentricity. The morning light filtering down through the barn floor created shifting patterns on the chamber walls as they worked. Jack had rigged up some battery-powered LED lights, but he found himself preferring the natural illumination when it was available. There was something almost sacred about the space, a quality of light and silence that made ordinary conversation. "You feel like whispered prayers." "Dad, I think this one's really special." Eli was standing beside a small tractor painted in faded red, its design simpler and more elegant than the larger machines surrounding it. The plate says it's a 1939 Ford Ferguson 9N. Jack joined his son and immediately saw what had caught Eli's attention. The little tractor was beautiful in the way that perfectly designed tools were beautiful. Every line served a purpose. Every component fitted exactly where it belonged. Unlike some of the larger machines in the collection, this one looked like it could start up and go to work without hesitation. This was the tractor that changed everything, Jack said, remembering something he'd read in one of Raymond's technical journals. Harry Ferguson designed a 3-point hitch system that made implements work better with the tractor. Before this, most farm equipment was just pulled behind the machine. This made the tractor and the implement work together as a system. "So, it was like the iPhone of tractors?" Jack smiled at his son's analogy. "Something like that. Revolutionary technology that seems obvious once you see it, but nobody had thought of it before." They spent the next hour going through Raymond's notes on the Ford Ferguson, learning about the partnership between Henry Ford and Irish inventor Harry Ferguson, about the handshake agreement that led to mass production of affordable tractors, about the lawsuit that eventually broke up the partnership and changed the agricultural equipment industry forever. "Uncle Raymond really studied this stuff," Eli observed, reading through pages of technical specifications and historical notes. "It's like he was writing a book about each tractor." That afternoon, they decided to attempt their first restoration project. Old Blue, the 1947 John Deere Model A, seemed like the logical choice. It was well documented in Raymond's notes, and the parts they might need were still available through specialty dealers. Jack had never restored anything more complex than a lawnmower, but Raymond's journals included detailed instructions for maintenance and repair of each machine in the collection. The writing was clear and methodical, assuming no prior knowledge, but building systematically toward more complex procedures. "Step 1, Jack read from Raymond's notes, is to develop a relationship with the machine. Sit in the operator's seat. Work the controls. Listen to the engine. Every tractor has its own personality, its own way of communicating what it needs." Eli grinned at the anthropomorphic language, but Jack found himself taking the advice seriously. He climbed onto Old Blue's seat and spent several minutes just sitting, hands on the steering wheel, feet on the pedals. trying to understand the machine from the operator's perspective. The view from the tractor seat was different than he'd expected. Higher than a modern car, but lower than a truck, with an unobstructed view in all directions. The controls were simple but substantial. A gear shift lever that required deliberate pressure to move, a clutch pedal that engaged with mechanical certainty, a throttle that responded immediately to input. "What do you think it needs?" Eli asked. Jack considered the question seriously. The engine ran smoothly, but there was a slight hesitation when he pressed the throttle. The steering felt loose, requiring more input than seemed right for such a precise machine. The hydraulics worked, but slowly, suggesting possible issues with the fluid or the pump. "I think it needs attention," Jack said finally. "Not major repair, just the kind of care that comes from someone who understands what it's supposed to do." They started with the basics, checking fluid levels, inspecting belts and hoses, cleaning years of accumulated dust and debris from the engine compartment. Raymond had left detailed maintenance logs for each machine, and Old Blue's records showed regular service through the early 2000s, then increasingly sporadic attention as Raymond aged. Working on the tractor together, Jack began to understand something about his son that he'd never fully appreciated before. Eli approached mechanical problems with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. But there was something more, an intuitive understanding of how things fit together, how systems worked, how problems revealed themselves too. "Careful observation. The hydraulic fluid is low," Eli reported after checking the reservoir, "and it looks kind of dark. What do you think that means?" "Probably needs to be changed. Like oil in a car, it gets dirty and doesn't work as well." Jack consulted Raymond's notes and found a detailed procedure for hydraulic fluid replacement, complete with specifications for the type of fluid and warnings about maintaining cleanliness during the process. His uncle had been thorough in his documentation, anticipating that someday someone else might need to maintain these machines. As they worked, Jack found himself thinking about inheritance in ways he never had before. When his own father had died 3 years earlier, the inheritance had been straightforward: a modest bank account, a small life insurance policy, a house that sold quickly in Portland's hot real estate market, financial assets that could be easily quantified and divided. But this was different. Raymond had left them something that couldn't be appraised or liquidated, something that required understanding and commitment and a willingness to carry forward a mission that most people would consider eccentric at best. "Dad, look at this." Eli had been exploring a workbench in the corner of the chamber and had discovered what appeared to be a parts catalogue. Its pages filled with exploded diagrams and part numbers for dozens of different tractor models. Jack joined his son and realized they were looking at something remarkable, a comprehensive reference guide that Raymond had compiled over decades of restoration work. The catalogue included not just part numbers and specifications, but notes on where to find components, which parts were interchangeable between different models, and alternative solutions for components that were no longer manufactured. "This is like a treasure map for fixing old tractors," Eli said. "More than that," Jack replied, flipping through pages that represented years of accumulated knowledge. This is how Raymond passed on what he learned. He knew that someday someone else would need to know this stuff. The afternoons stretched long. As they worked, father and son gradually developing a rhythm of discovery and learning that felt natural and right. Jack had forgotten how satisfying it could be to work with his hands, to solve problems through careful observation and systematic thinking rather than email chains and conference calls. "I think Uncle Raymond left us more than just tractors," Eli said, as they prepared to head back to the house for dinner. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe he left us a way to do something that matters, something real." Jack looked around the chamber one more time before turning off the lights, at the rows of preserved machines, at the careful documentation, at the evidence of one man's lifelong commitment to saving something the world had decided wasn't worth saving. His son might be right. Maybe Raymond had left them more than an inheritance. Maybe he'd left them a calling. The Purple Heart lay nestled in tissue paper inside a small wooden box, tucked beneath a collection of vintage spark plugs in one of Raymond's toolboxes. Eli found it while searching for a specific wrench size, and his sharp intake of breath drew Jack's attention from the carburetor he'd been cleaning. "Dad, you need to see this." Jack set down his work and joined his son beside the open toolbox. The medal was exactly what it appeared to be. The distinctive purple ribbon and heart-shaped pendant that the military awarded to soldiers wounded in combat. But it wasn't Raymond's name engraved on the back. Staff Sergeant James P. Morrison. Jack read aloud, "European Theatre, 1944. Beneath the medal, wrapped in the same tissue paper, was a photograph showing two young men in military uniforms standing beside what appeared to be a military vehicle. One of them was clearly Raymond, recognizable despite his youth and the formal pose required by military photography. The other, according to the handwriting on the back, was James Morrison, Jim to his friends. Why would Uncle Raymond have someone else's Purple Heart? Eli asked. It was a good question, and one that led Jack to search through more of Raymond's documentation with renewed purpose. He found the answer in a folder labeled Jim's Collection, filled with correspondence dating from the late 1940s. Through the early 1960s, the letters told a story that Jack found both heartbreaking and inspiring. James Morrison had returned from the war with injuries that prevented him from farming the way he'd done before deployment. His family's farm in the Willamette Valley was struggling to modernize, and Jim couldn't afford to keep the older equipment running while investing in newer, more efficient machines. "Raymond," one letter read, "I hate to ask, but I'm wondering if you'd be interested in taking the old Alice off my hands. I know it's not much to look at anymore, but she ran good for Dad before the war, and I'd rather see her go to someone who appreciates what she meant to our family than send her to the scrapyard. Can't pay you much to take her. Times are tight, but I remember you talking about preserving the old machines." Raymond's response was clipped to the letter, "Jim, it would be my honor to give your family's tractor the care she deserves, and you don't owe me a penny. Consider it my small way of saying thank you for your service." The correspondence continued. Through the 1950s, with Jim Morrison serving as one of Raymond's key contacts in the farming community, helping identify machines that were headed for scrap and families who might be willing to sell to someone who valued preservation over profit. Morrison had a network, Jack realized, reading through letters that referenced dozens of other farmers, mechanics, and equipment dealers who were part of an informal preservation community. He was helping Uncle Raymond save tractors all over the state. What happened to him? Eli asked. Jack found the answer in a sympathy card dated August 1963. Jim Morrison had died of complications related to his war injuries, leaving behind a widow and two young children. Raymond had attended the funeral, and according to a brief journal entry, had made a commitment to Jim's widow that her husband's collection would always have a home. "That's why he kept the Purple Heart," Jack said quietly. "It wasn't just a medal to him, it was a reminder of the man who helped him get started." The discovery of Jim Morrison's story led them to pay closer attention to the individual histories behind each machine in Raymond's collection. Many of the tractors came with documentation about their original owners, not just purchase dates and mechanical specifications, but stories about the families who had depended on these machines for their livelihoods. A 1948 Ford 8N had belonged to the Hansen family, Norwegian immigrants who had cleared timberland in the Cascade foothills and turned it into a dairy operation that supported 3 generations. The tractor had worked that farm for 30 years before the family sold out to developers who turned the pastures into suburban housing. A 1952 International Harvester Farmall Super C had been the pride of the Rodriguez family's vegetable farm in the Hood River Valley. According to Raymond's notes, it had been the first tractor purchased by Miguel Rodriguez after he'd saved enough money from seasonal work to buy his own land. The machine had been lovingly maintained through 2 decades of planting and harvesting. before Miguel's arthritis forced him to sell the farm and move to town. Uncle Raymond wasn't just collecting tractors, Eli observed as they read through another family's story. He was collecting memories. Jack was beginning to understand that his son was right. Each machine in the collection represented not just a piece of equipment, but a family's history, a way of life, a connection to the land that had largely disappeared from modern America. Raymond had been preserving something more valuable than antique machinery. He'd been saving stories. That afternoon they had their first visitor. Jack was adjusting the carburetor on Old Blue when he heard footsteps on the ladder leading down to the chamber. He looked up to see a woman in her 70s, descending carefully, her movements deliberate but confident. "You must be Jack," she said, reaching the bottom of the ladder and extending a work-weathered hand. "I'm Martha Henderson. I live in the next valley over." Martha had the kind of presence that came from decades of rural living: practical clothes, sensible shoes, and the direct gaze of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. She looked around the chamber with obvious familiarity, nodding approvingly at the preserved machinery. "Raymond told me about this place." "Oh, must be 15 years ago now," she said. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd check on whoever inherited the farm, make sure they understood what they'd found." "Did you know him well?" Jack asked. "Well enough. Raymond wasn't much for socializing, but he was a good neighbor, helped me with my hay equipment when my husband passed. Never asked for anything in return, except maybe to listen to him talk about these old machines." Martha walked between the rows of tractors with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd grown up around farm equipment. She paused beside a small red tractor, running her hand along its hood with obvious affection. "That's my father's old Farmhouse Cub," she said. "Raymond bought it from me in '87 when I couldn't justify keeping it anymore. Dad taught me to drive on that little tractor when I was barely old enough to reach the pedals. Would you like to see if it still runs?" Eli asked. Martha's face lit up with genuine pleasure. That would be something. They spent the next hour getting the Farmhouse Cub started, Martha providing guidance based on her childhood memories of the machine's quirks and preferences. When the little tractor finally rumbled to life, her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "Sounds just like it did when I was 12 years old," she said, climbing into the operator's seat with practiced ease. "Some things don't change, even when everything else does." As Martha drove the small tractor around the chamber, Jack found himself understanding something new about Raymond's mission. This wasn't just about preserving machinery. It was about maintaining connections to a way of life that had shaped entire generations of American families. The tractors were tangible links to memories, to skills, to relationships with the land that couldn't be replicated by modern equipment. "Raymond did something important here," Martha said, after they'd shut down the tractor and climbed back up. "To ground level, he saved pieces of people's lives, gave them somewhere safe to live on after the farms were sold and the families scattered." Over coffee in the farmhouse kitchen, Martha told them more about Raymond and his preservation work. He'd been something of a legend in the farming community, she explained. The eccentric bachelor who would drive hundreds of miles to rescue a tractor from the scrapyard, who could fix anything with an engine, who knew the history of every piece of equipment in 3 counties. "He had help, you know," Martha said. "Lots of folks who believed in what he was doing. Jim Morrison before he passed, and Tom Brewster over in Salem, and the Kowalski brothers who ran the machine shop in Independence. Raymond was the heart of it, but there were others who shared his passion." "Are any of them still around?" Jack asked. "Tom's still alive, still fixing old equipment in his retirement. The Kowalskis sold their shop, but they might be willing to help if you asked nice. There's a whole community of people who care about this stuff. You just have to know where to find them." As Martha prepared to leave, she paused at the door and fixed Jack with a serious look. "Raymond spent 40 years building this collection," she said. "It wasn't just a hobby for him, it was a calling. He believed these machines deserved better than the scrapyard, and he was willing to sacrifice a lot to make sure they survived." I hope you'll think carefully before you decide what to do with his legacy." After Martha left, Jack and Eli sat on the front porch as evening settled over the Oregon hills. The barn swallow that had nested in their kitchen called from somewhere in the growing darkness, and an owl answered from the edge of the forest that bordered their property. "She's right, isn't she?" Eli said finally, "about this being important." Jack considered his son's question while watching stars appear in the clear mountain sky. A month ago, he'd been a failed businessman facing foreclosure, desperate enough to accept any kind of shelter for himself and his son. Now he was beginning to understand that they'd inherited something far more complex and valuable than a rundown farmhouse. They'd become the custodians of one man's 4-decade mission to preserve a disappearing way of life. "I think so," he said. "I think Uncle Raymond left us something that matters. The question is whether we're up to taking care of it." "I think we are," Eli said with the quiet confidence that had always impressed his father. "I think maybe this is what we're supposed to be doing." Jack looked at his 11-year-old son and realized that Eli might be right. Maybe their financial disaster and forced exile to Oregon hadn't been the end of their story. Maybe it had been the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined just a few weeks earlier. The hand-drawn map was more detailed than the first one they'd discovered, sketched on the back of a feed store receipt in Raymond's careful handwriting. This one showed not just locations, but routes between them, elevation changes, and what appeared to be coded notations about the accessibility of each site. Jack found it tucked inside a manila envelope marked Emergency Distribution Plan that also contained keys, property deeds, and contact information for lawyers in 3 different counties. "Look at this," Jack said, spreading the map across the kitchen table while Eli finished his breakfast. "He's got sites marked all the way from Salem to Bend. That's got to be 200 miles. Eli studied the map with the focused attention he brought to everything that caught his interest. "What's this mean?" he asked, pointing to a series of small symbols beside each marked location. Jack examined the legend Raymond had drawn in the margin. A circle meant the site was on private property with cooperative owners. A square indicated locations where the equipment was hidden, but the landowners might not know about it. A triangle marked sites that required special access or had seasonal restrictions. Uncle Raymond was thinking about the long term, Jack realized. This isn't just a map, it's a contingency plan, like he knew someday he might not be able to take care of everything himself. The telephone rang, interrupting their analysis. Jack had been avoiding most calls since their move to Oregon, but this one showed a local area code. "Jack Mercer. This is Tom Brewster. Martha Henderson gave me your number. Said you might be interested in talking about Raymond's collection." Tom's voice carried the careful cadence of someone who'd spent decades choosing words carefully, but there was enthusiasm beneath the measured tone. He explained that he'd been one of Raymond's closest collaborators in the preservation network, helping to restore engines and locate parts for machines that had been out of production for decades. "I've got some equipment that belonged to the collection," Tom said. "Raymond asked me to hold on to it for safekeeping in case something happened." "To the main site. Martha says you're serious about continuing his work." An hour later, Jack and Eli were following Tom's pickup truck down a series of increasingly narrow dirt roads that wound through the foothills east of Salem. Tom Brewster turned out to be a lean, weathered man in his 70s, who moved with the economical grace of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. His property sat in a hidden valley, accessible only through a gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges. The barn that housed his portion of Raymond's network was newer than the one on Jack's property, built with modern materials but designed to look like it belonged to an earlier era. "Raymond helped me plan this building," Tom explained as he led them inside. "Said if we were going to preserve history, we needed to do it right. Climate-controlled, proper drainage, security that doesn't look like security." The interior took Jack's breath away. Where Raymond's underground chamber had the feel of a hidden sanctuary, Tom's barn was organized like a professional museum. Tractors and implements were arranged in chronological order, each one accompanied by detailed placards that explained its significance in the development of American agriculture. LED lighting highlighted the machine's restored finishes, and the concrete floor was polished to a shine that reflected the overhead fixtures. "Holy cow," Eli whispered, echoing his reaction to their first discovery of Raymond's collection. "This is what Raymond wanted to build eventually," Tom said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "A proper museum where people could come to learn about the machines that fed America. He just never had the resources to make it happen on his own property." They walked between the displays, Tom providing commentary on each machine's history and significance. A 1918 Fordson Model F, one of the first mass-produced tractors that made mechanized farming accessible to small operations. A 1935 Alice Chalmers WC, the first tractor designed with pneumatic rubber tires instead of steel wheels. A 1960 John Deere 4010, the machine that established the template for modern four-wheel drive tractors. "Raymond and I worked on most of these together," Tom said, running his hand along the fender of a beautifully restored 1949 Farmhouse H. "He'd find them, usually in pretty rough shape, and bring them here for restoration. I had the shop space and the tools. He had the vision and the patience." "How long did this take?" Jack asked, gesturing at the impressive display. "About 20 years, working mostly weekends and evenings. Raymond was particular about doing things right. No shortcuts, no compromises. Every machine had to be restored to better than original condition, with complete documentation of its history and significance." Eli had wandered over to a display case filled with smaller items, vintage tools, advertising materials, operators' manuals, and what appeared to be personal artifacts from the original owners of various machines. "These came with the tractors," Tom explained, joining the boy at the display case. "Raymond insisted on preserving the whole story, not just the machines themselves. That wrench set belonged to Carl Peterson, who farmed with the same farmall for 37 years. Those work gloves were Frank Morrison's, Jim's older brother, who died in Korea but whose family kept his tractor running until the 1970s. Jack studied the collection with growing understanding. This wasn't just about preserving machinery, it was about maintaining connections to the people who had depended on these machines, who had built their lives around the rhythm of planting and harvest, who had passed their knowledge and their equipment from one generation to the next until economic pressures and technological change had broken the chain. "Tom, can I ask you something?" Jack said. "Why did Raymond keep everything so secret? This is incredible work. Why not share it with the world?" Tom's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. Raymond was a private man, but that wasn't the real reason. The truth is, he was worried about what would happen if the wrong people found out about the collection. What kind of wrong people? Developers, mostly. And certain collectors who were more interested in profit than preservation. Raymond had offers over the years, serious money from people who wanted to buy individual machines or even the whole collection. He always turned them down, but the attention made him nervous. Tom led them to a corner of the barn where a small office area had been set up with filing cabinets and a desk covered with correspondence. He pulled out a folder marked Hancock Development and showed them letters dating back to the 1990s. "Harold Hancock's been trying to buy Raymond's property for 25 years, Tom explained. Always claimed he wanted to develop it for housing, but Raymond suspected there was more to it than that. The offers kept getting bigger, way more than the land was worth for residential development." Jack read through several of the letters, noting the increasingly aggressive tone as the years progressed. The most recent correspondence, dated just 6 months before Raymond's death, included veiled threats about tax assessments and zoning compliance that made Jack's stomach tighten. With familiar dread, "Hancock's still sniffing around," Tom said. Martha mentioned she's seen his people driving past your place, taking pictures. You might want to be careful about who you trust with information about the collection. The warning added a new dimension to Jack's thinking about their inheritance. It was one thing to consider the responsibility of preserving Raymond's life work. It was another to realize that there might be people actively working to prevent that preservation. Is there legal protection for something like this? Jack asked. Some. Historic preservation laws, agricultural heritage designations, but it's complicated and expensive, and you need to know how to work the system. Raymond never wanted to deal with that kind of bureaucracy. They spent the rest of the morning going through Tom's documentation, learning about the scope and complexity of Raymond's preservation network. The collection was far larger than Jack had initially realized, more than 1,200 pieces of equipment spread across 43 locations in 7 counties. Tom had detailed records of everything, including photographs, restoration notes, and contact information for the property owners who were hosting hidden caches of agricultural history. Some of these people don't even know what they're protecting, Tom explained. Raymond was careful about that. He'd make arrangements to store equipment in unused barns or sheds, sometimes paying rent, sometimes just as a favor. The owners knew he was preserving old farm equipment, but not necessarily the full scope of what they were part of. How did he coordinate all of this? Carefully. Raymond had a network of maybe 20 people who really understood what he was doing: mechanics, historians, collectors, farmers who shared his passion. We'd meet a few times a year, usually at farm shows or antique tractor pulls, to share information and coordinate efforts. Tom pulled out a photograph showing a group of men standing beside a restored steam tractor at what appeared to be a county fair. Raymond was in the center of the group, looking younger and more relaxed than Jack had seen him in any other pictures. That was taken in 1998 at the Marion County Fair, Tom said. Raymond had just finished restoring that 1912 Case steam engine. Took him 3 years to find all the parts and get everything working right. He was so proud that day, seeing kids and grandparents standing together, watching that old machine run. He looks happy, Eli observed. He was. Raymond loved sharing the history, explaining how the machines worked, helping people understand the connection between past and present. He just didn't like the attention that came with publicity. As they prepared to leave Tom's barn museum, the older man pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand something," Tom said seriously. What Raymond built wasn't just a collection. It was a movement, a quiet, patient effort to preserve something important that was disappearing. There are people all over the country doing similar work, but Raymond was special. He had vision and dedication, and the ability to inspire others to care about things they might not have noticed otherwise. What are you saying? I'm saying you've inherited more than tractors and property. You've inherited leadership of something that matters to a lot of people. There are folks waiting to see what you're going to do with Raymond's legacy, whether you'll continue his work or just sell everything off and walk away. Jack looked back at the barn, at the carefully preserved machines and the meticulous documentation of 40 years of preservation work, and felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to lead anything," he said. "Raymond wasn't qualified either when he started," Tom replied. "He was just a young man who saw something worth saving and was willing to do the work. The qualification came from caring enough to keep going, even when it was difficult." On the drive home, Eli was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing landscape of farms and forests. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, I think Uncle Raymond was building something bigger than just saving old tractors." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe he was trying to save a way of thinking about things. Like, instead of just throwing away everything. That gets old. Maybe we could take care of it and learn from it and pass it on to people who come after us." Jack considered his son's observation as they wound their way back through the hills toward home. Maybe Eli was right. Maybe Raymond's preservation network wasn't just about agricultural history. Maybe it was about resistance to a culture that measured value only in terms of efficiency and profit, that saw age as obsolescence rather than wisdom. If that was true, then they'd inherited not just a collection, but a philosophy, not just property, but a calling. The question was whether they were brave enough or foolish enough to accept it. The leather-bound ledger was thicker than the journals they'd found earlier, its pages filled with entries that went far beyond mechanical specifications. Jack discovered it in a fireproof safe hidden behind a false panel in Raymond's workshop, along with property deeds, insurance policies, and what appeared to be a complete genealogy of American farm equipment manufacturing. But it was the personal stories that captured Jack's attention as he and Eli sat at the kitchen table, reading by lamplight, while rain drummed against the windows of the old farmhouse. "Listen to this," Jack said, finding an entry dated September 12, 1967. "Today I picked up the Alice Chalmers WD-45 from the Kowalski farm. Anna Kowalski cried when they loaded it onto the trailer. She said it was the tractor her husband bought when they first came to America from Poland, that he'd worked 18-hour days for 3 years to pay it off. She made me promise to take good care of it, said it represented everything her family had sacrificed to build their new life." Eli looked up from his own reading, a section dedicated to international harvester tractors and their role in mechanizing Midwestern agriculture. "Every machine has a story, doesn't it?" "More than that," Jack said, flipping through pages that documented hundreds of similar transactions. "Every machine represents a family, a dream, a way of life that's mostly gone." Now, the ledger revealed the full scope of Raymond's mission in ways that the technical documentation couldn't capture. He hadn't just been collecting tractors. He'd been preserving the stories of the people who'd depended on them. German immigrants who'd cleared timberland in the Cascades, Dust Bowl refugees who'd come west seeking fresh starts, veterans who'd returned from war to find farming changed forever. Mexican families who'd worked their way from field labor to farm ownership over generations. Each entry included not just the mechanical details of the equipment, but the human details that gave the machines meaning. The 1953 Ford Jubilee that had been a wedding gift from father to son. The 1940 John Deere Model H that had been the first tractor purchased by a sharecropper who'd saved enough money to buy his own land. The 1959 Massey Ferguson 65 that had worked the same family farm for 4 generations before suburban development forced its sale. "Uncle Raymond was like a historian," Eli said, reading an entry about a case tractor that had been used to clear land for what eventually became Portland International Airport. He wrote down everything. "More than a historian," Jack corrected, beginning to understand something profound about his uncle's motivation. Historians record what happened. Raymond was trying to save pieces of what happened so future generations could touch it, experience it, learn from it in ways that books can't teach. The phone rang, interrupting their reading. Jack had been getting more calls lately. Word was spreading through the rural community about Raymond's collection and the city man who'd inherited it. Most were friendly inquiries from people who'd known Raymond or were interested in old farm equipment. A few were from reporters or researchers who'd heard rumors about the preservation network. This call was different. "Mr. Mercer? This is Harold Hancock with Hancock Development. I understand you've recently inherited the old Mercer property." Jack felt his stomach tighten at the name he'd seen on all those aggressive letters in Tom Brewster's files. "Yes, I'm calling because my company has had a long-standing interest in that property. We made several generous offers to your uncle over the years, offers that were unfortunately declined. But I'm hoping we might find common ground now that circumstances have changed." Hancock's voice had the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and intimidation. Jack found himself thinking of the used car salesmen and predatory loan officers he'd encountered during his own financial difficulties. People who made their living convincing desperate people to make bad decisions. "I'm not interested in selling," Jack said. "Well, I certainly understand that. It's a big decision, and you probably need time to assess the property's condition and potential. But I want you to know that we're prepared to make an offer that reflects current market conditions, plus a premium for the inconvenience of a quick sale." I said, "I'm not interested. Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand the situation you've inherited. That property has significant maintenance issues, tax liabilities, and regulatory compliance problems that could cost you a great deal of money. My offer would relieve you of those burdens and provide a substantial return on your inheritance." Jack felt his temper rising, but forced himself to keep his voice level. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Hancock, but my decision stands. I'll be in touch," Hancock said before hanging up, and something in his tone suggested it wasn't really a request. Jack stared at the phone for a moment, then looked at Eli, who'd been listening to the conversation with obvious concern. "That's the guy Tom warned us about?" Eli asked. "That's him, and I don't think he's going to give up easily." They returned to Raymond's ledger, but Jack found it hard to concentrate on the historical entries while thinking about Hancock's call. The developer's mention of tax liabilities and regulatory compliance problems sounded like the kind of bureaucratic warfare that had helped drive Jack into bankruptcy in the first place. "Dad, look at this entry," Eli said, pointing to a page. Dated December 15th, 1983, Uncle Raymond wrote about someone trying to buy his property. Jack read the entry aloud. "Hancock came by again today with another offer. This one 20% higher than the last. He says he wants to develop the land for housing, but I've done some checking and there's more to it than that. Martha Henderson's cousin works at the county planning office, and she says Hancock's been researching mineral rights and geological surveys. He's not interested in building houses. He's looking for something underground. I told him the property isn't for sale at any price, but I don't think he believed me. Going to have to be more careful about who knows what I'm doing here." "Mineral rights," Jack said thoughtfully. "That explains why he's been so persistent." "What kind of minerals?" "Could be anything. Gravel, timber rights, maybe something more valuable. The point is, Hancock's been playing a long game for decades, and he's not going to stop just because I said no." The rain continued through the evening as they worked their way through more of Raymond's documentation. Jack was beginning to understand that his uncle had been fighting a battle on multiple fronts, not just to preserve agricultural history, but to protect the land and the community that had supported his mission. The ledger included correspondence with lawyers, tax assessors, zoning officials, and historic preservation societies. Raymond had been methodically building legal protections for his work, filing for agricultural exemptions, historic designations, and conservation easements that would make development more difficult even after his death. He was thinking about the future, Jack realized, reading through documents that showed Raymond had been planning for succession long before his final illness. He knew he couldn't live forever, so he was trying to create protections that would survive him. "Is it enough?" Eli asked. Jack studied the legal documents with the eye of someone who'd learned about bureaucratic warfare the hard way. Raymond had been thorough, but he'd also been working within a system designed to favor development over preservation, profit over history. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's a start." But the next morning brought visitors. 3 men in their 60s who introduced themselves as members of the Pacific Northwest Antique Tractor Association. They'd heard about Raymond's death and wanted to pay their respects to his collection. "Raymond was a legend in our community," explained Carl Martinez, who served as the association's president. "Most of us got started in collecting because of something he taught us or some machine he helped us restore." They spent the morning in the underground chamber, the visitors sharing stories about Raymond and the impact he'd had on their own preservation efforts. Each man had been part of Raymond's informal network, helping to identify and save equipment that might otherwise have been scrapped. "People don't understand what we're losing," said Frank Chen, a retired engineer who specialized in restoring vintage steam tractors. "These machines represent more than just agricultural history. They're examples of American engineering and manufacturing at its peak. The craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the expectation that equipment would last for generations rather than years. Everything's disposable now," added Bob Williams, whose own collection focused on small tractors and garden equipment. "Break down, throw it away, buy a new one." Raymond understood that we were losing something important when we stopped valuing things that were built to last. As the visitors prepared to leave, Carl Martinez pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. "I don't want to alarm you," he said, "but there's been talk in our community about pressure being put on people who are storing pieces of Raymond's collection. Nothing overt, but property tax reassessments, zoning inspections, that kind of thing. Someone's been asking questions about Raymond's network. Hancock. We don't have proof, but the timing's suspicious. 3 different storage sites have had routine compliance visits in the past month. The message is pretty clear. Cooperating with preservation efforts might have consequences." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon weather. If Hancock was willing to use bureaucratic pressure against people who were simply storing old farm equipment, what might he be willing to do to get control of Raymond's main collection? "What do you think I should do?" Jack asked. "Document everything, get legal advice, and be careful about who you trust. Raymond spent 40 years building this network, but it could be destroyed a lot faster than it was created." That evening, as Jack and Eli returned to Raymond's ledger, they found themselves reading not just about the past, but about their own uncertain future. The stories of families who'd lost their farms to economic pressure or development felt uncomfortably familiar to someone who'd lost his own home to foreclosure. But there was also inspiration in those pages. Stories of people who'd found ways to preserve what mattered to them, who'd resisted pressure to sell out or give up, who'd passed their values and their knowledge to the next generation despite the odds against them. "Dad," Eli said as they prepared for bed, "do you think we can do what Uncle Raymond did? Save all this stuff and keep it safe?" Jack looked at his 11-year-old son, this quiet, thoughtful boy who'd thrown himself into learning about antique tractors with the same dedication he'd once brought to video games, and felt a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. "I think we have to try," he said. "I think maybe that's why we're here." The deed was hidden in a manila envelope, taped to the underside of Raymond's workbench drawer, discovered by accident. When Eli knocked over a can of penetrating oil while searching for a specific wrench size, the liquid seeped into the wood joints, revealing the outline of the hidden envelope like invisible ink developing under heat. Jack carefully peeled away the tape and extracted documents that had clearly been placed there as a final safeguard. Papers that Raymond had wanted to keep secret until the right person inherited his mission and had reason to look for them. The first document was a property deed dated 1962, showing that Raymond had purchased not just the 47 acres they'd known about, but an additional 847 acres of surrounding timberland, watershed, and mineral rights. The second was a geological survey commissioned in 1987, documenting significant deposits of high-grade gravel and sand beneath the property, materials worth millions of dollars to the right buyer. The third document made Jack's hands shake as he read it. "Certificate of Military Service," he read aloud to Eli. "Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded to Raymond James Mercer for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty during combat operations in the European theater, October 1944. Jack stared at the certificate, trying to reconcile the quiet, reclusive man his father had described with the decorated war hero documented in official military records. Raymond hadn't just been a veteran, he'd been one of the most highly decorated soldiers in American military history, awarded the nation's highest honor for combat heroism. Why would he hide this? Eli asked, studying a copy of the citation. That described Raymond's actions in remarkable detail. Jack read the official account of his uncle's heroism, how Staff Sergeant Raymond Mercer had single-handedly held a strategic position against overwhelming enemy forces for 18 hours, allowing his battalion to evacuate wounded comrades and establish a defensive perimeter. How he'd used captured enemy weapons and improvised explosives to delay a German advance that could have resulted in hundreds of American casualties. "I think he didn't want people to see him differently," Jack said finally. "Your grandfather always said Raymond was a quiet man who didn't like attention. But there was more in the envelope. Photographs, letters, and documents that revealed the true scope of what Raymond had been protecting. The mineral deposits beneath his property weren't just valuable for construction materials. According to more recent geological surveys, the land contained rare earth elements used in advanced electronics manufacturing, materials that had become increasingly valuable as international supplies became less reliable. A letter from a mining consortium, dated just 2 months before Raymond's death, offered $12 million for mineral rights alone, separate from any consideration for the surface property. Raymond had apparently never responded to the offer, but he'd kept the documentation along with detailed notes about the environmental impact that large-scale mining would have on the watershed and the surrounding ecosystem. "Now I understand why Hancock's been so persistent," Jack said, studying maps that showed the mineral deposits extending beneath several neighboring properties. "He's not just looking at one development project, he's looking at an extraction operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Eli was examining another document from the envelope, what appeared to be a letter addressed to "my heir" in Raymond's careful handwriting. "Dad, I think this is for you," he said. Jack took the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've found the collection. It also means you've been curious enough and persistent enough to discover what I really left you, not just old tractors, but the responsibility to protect something much larger. The machines were never the real treasure, though I hope you'll understand their value by now. The real treasure is the land itself. The watershed that supplies clean water to 3 counties, the forests that provide habitat for wildlife, and the agricultural potential that could feed families for generations to come. Harold Hancock and his associates have been trying to acquire this property for mineral extraction since the 1980s. They see dollar signs where I see legacy, profit where I see responsibility to future generations. The geological surveys in this envelope will show you what they're after, but I hope they'll also show you what would be lost if mining operations were allowed to proceed. I spent my war fighting to protect American values and American land from people who would destroy both. For temporary gain, I've spent my peace doing the same thing, just against different enemies using different weapons. The tractors were my cover story, my way of building a community of people who understood the importance of preserving things that matter, even when the world around them wants to treat them as disposable. You have legal protections that I spent decades putting in place, historic designations, conservation easements, agricultural exemptions that make development difficult but not impossible. More importantly, you have something I never had, a son to carry the mission forward, to learn from what I preserved and to adapt it for challenges I couldn't anticipate. The choice is yours. You can sell to Hancock and walk away wealthy, or you can accept the responsibility of stewardship and fight to preserve something irreplaceable. I hope you'll choose preservation, but I understand if you don't. Either way, you should know what you're choosing between. Your Uncle Raymond P.S. The Medal of Honor documentation is in case you need federal protection for the property. Military heritage sites have stronger legal protections than agricultural or historical designations alone. Jack set down the letter and looked around the underground chamber with completely new understanding. Raymond hadn't been an eccentric collector hiding from the world. He'd been a strategic thinker, building defenses against forces that would have destroyed everything he valued. The tractor collection had been both genuine preservation effort and elaborate camouflage for a conservation mission that covered nearly 1,000 acres of Oregon wilderness. "We're not just inheriting tractors," Jack said quietly. "We're inheriting a fight." "What kind of fight?" Eli asked, though his expression suggested he already understood more than an 11-year-old should have to worry about. "The same fight Uncle Raymond was fighting for 40 years. The same fight a lot of people are fighting all over the country, whether we preserve things that matter or let them be destroyed for short-term profit." Jack thought about his own recent experience with financial predators, about the way market forces and corporate pressure had dismantled his career and his family's security. Raymond's situation was different in scale, but identical in principle: powerful interests using legal and economic pressure to force ordinary people to give up things they valued. The difference was that Raymond had spent decades preparing for the fight, building legal protections and community support that made resistance possible. Jack was starting from scratch, with an 11-year-old son, and no experience in the kind of bureaucratic warfare that would be required to protect their inheritance. "What do we do?" Eli asked. Jack studied the documents spread across the workbench: property, deeds, geological surveys, military records, legal opinions, and photographs that documented 40 years of careful preparation. Raymond had left them more than land and machinery. He'd left them a battle plan. First, we get legal advice, professional help from people who understand conservation law and mineral rights. Then we contact the preservation network and let them know what we're really dealing with. And then, Jack paused, thinking about the implications of what he was about to commit to. We fight to keep this land safe, even if it means staying here permanently, even if we never get to go back to the city. Jack looked at his son, this thoughtful, resilient boy who'd adapted to rural life with remarkable grace, who'd thrown himself into learning about tractors and agricultural history with genuine enthusiasm, who seemed to understand instinctively what they'd inherited, and realized that going back to the city had stopped being an option somewhere. Along the way, even then, he said, maybe especially then, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Jack climbed up from the chamber to see 3 black SUVs pulling into their driveway, followed by Harold Hancock in a silver Mercedes sedan. The convoy had the feel of a military operation, designed to intimidate through overwhelming presence. Hancock emerged from his car, wearing an expensive suit and the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm and veiled threats. His associates looked like corporate lawyers or private security personnel, professional, well-dressed, and vaguely menacing. "Mr. Mercer," Hancock called out as Jack emerged from the barn. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I was in the area and thought we might continue our conversation from the other day." Jack felt Eli move closer to his side and put a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "I told you I wasn't interested in selling." "Yes, but I don't think you fully understand your situation," Hancock replied, his smile never wavering. "I've had my people do some research on your property, and there are some significant issues you need to know about." One of Hancock's associates stepped forward with a briefcase full of documents. "Tax liens, environmental compliance violations, zoning infractions that could result in substantial fines," the man recited in a flat, bureaucratic tone. "The county's been very patient, but patience has limits." Jack recognized the tactic from his own experience with predatory lenders: create a crisis through bureaucratic pressure, then offer a solution that happened to benefit the people who'd created the crisis in the first place. "I'll deal with those issues through proper legal channels," Jack said. "Of course," Hancock replied, though his tone suggested he doubted Jack's ability to navigate the complexities involved. "But legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee of favorable outcomes. My offer would eliminate all those problems while providing substantial compensation for your inconvenience. The answer is still no. Hancock's smile finally faltered slightly. Mr. Mercer, I don't think you appreciate the resources at my disposal, or the determination of my organization. This property will be developed one way or another. The only question is whether you'll be part of the solution or part of the problem. Jack felt his temper rising, but forced himself to remain calm. Raymond had spent decades dealing with similar pressure, and he'd survived by being smarter and more patient than his opponents. "Mr. Hancock," he said quietly, "I think you should leave now. And I think you should know that this property has federal protections you might not be aware of." "What kind of protections?" Jack thought about the Medal of Honor documentation hidden in the envelope downstairs, about the military heritage designation that could provide legal safeguards against exactly the kind of pressure Hancock was applying. "A kind that make your threats irrelevant," he said. "Good afternoon." Hancock stared at him for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to having his offers refused so definitively. Then he nodded to his associates and returned to his car without another word. As the convoy disappeared down their gravel driveway, Eli looked up at his father with obvious admiration. "You think that'll stop him?" he asked. "Probably not," Jack admitted. "But maybe it'll buy us time to figure out our next move." That evening, as they returned to Raymond's documentation, Jack began to understand that they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. By refusing Hancock's offer and hinting at federal protection, he'd committed himself and his son to a fight that could last years and might ultimately be unwinnable. But looking at the Medal of Honor certificate, at the photographs of Raymond with his preserved tractors, at his uncle's patient documentation of a lifetime spent fighting to preserve things that mattered, Jack realized he was okay with that commitment. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the odds. Raymond's final letter lay on the kitchen table like a battle plan written by a ghost, its careful instructions both inspiring and terrifying in their scope. Jack had found it sealed in an envelope marked "When all else fails," hidden beneath a false bottom in his uncle's desk drawer that had taken 3 days of careful searching to discover. "My dear nephew," the letter began in Raymond's familiar handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means the legal protections I built over 4 decades have failed, and you're facing the kind of pressure that threatens everything we've worked to preserve. Don't despair. I've been preparing for this moment since 1962, when I first realized that preserving agricultural history would eventually require more than just hiding old tractors. What I'm about to tell you must never be shared with anyone who hasn't earned your complete trust." The tractor collection was always the cover story for something larger, a network of preservation that extends far beyond machinery to include land, water rights, mineral resources, and the cultural heritage of rural America. You are now the steward of the most significant private conservation effort in Oregon history, and there are people who will stop at nothing to destroy it. Jack paused in his reading to look at Eli, who was carefully cleaning spark plugs from a 1952 Farmhouse Super C they'd brought up from the underground chamber. His son had adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience, treating each revelation about Raymond's secret mission as another puzzle to be solved rather than a burden to be endured. "Listen to this," Jack continued reading aloud. "The Medal of Honor designation provides federal protection, but only if properly activated. Contact Colonel James Morrison, retired Army Pentagon liaison for historic preservation. He's the grandson of Jim Morrison, the veteran who helped me get started. His number is in my address book. Tell him the phrase Iron Horse Protocol, and he'll understand what you need." "Iron Horse Protocol?" Eli asked, looking up from his work. Apparently, Uncle Raymond had contingency plans, even for his contingency. "Plans," Jack said, continuing to read. "The network I built includes 43 storage sites, but also 12 families who have been quietly documenting the destruction of agricultural heritage in their own communities. When activated, this network can provide testimony, evidence, and political pressure that will make development of our property a national controversy rather than a local zoning issue. But timing is everything. The network can only be activated once, and only when the threat is imminent and documented. You'll need proof that Hancock is willing to use illegal pressure, evidence that his development plans would cause irreversible environmental damage, and media coverage that frames the issue in terms of American heritage under attack. Jack set down the letter and looked around their kitchen, this ordinary room in a supposedly worthless farmhouse that had become the command center for a resistance movement 40 years in the making. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd fled the corporate world, only to find himself planning strategy against the same kind of predatory development that had consumed his previous life. "Dad, someone's coming," Eli said, looking out the window at a familiar pickup truck turning into their driveway. Tom Brewster emerged from his vehicle with the urgent stride of someone bearing important news. Behind him came Martha Henderson, and two men Jack didn't recognize, one elderly gentleman in a veteran's cap and a younger man with the serious demeanor of someone accustomed to solving other people's problems. "Jack, we need to talk," Tom said without preamble. "Things are moving faster than we expected." They gathered around the kitchen table as Tom introduced the visitors. The elderly man was Frank Morrison, Jim Morrison's younger brother and a Korean war veteran who'd been part of Raymond's network for decades. The younger man was his nephew, Colonel James Morrison, recently retired from the Pentagon's Historic Preservation Office. "Tom called me yesterday about your situation," Colonel Morrison said in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials. "When he mentioned the Medal of Honor documentation and the phrase Iron Horse Protocol, I caught the first flight to Portland." "You knew Uncle Raymond?" Jack asked. "My grandfather Jim was Raymond's closest friend and collaborator," Morrison explained. "My family has been part of this preservation network for 3 generations. Raymond asked me to serve as military liaison in case federal intervention ever became necessary." Martha Henderson leaned forward with the focused intensity Jack had learned to respect. "Harold Hancock filed papers with the county yesterday morning. He's claiming that your property has been in violation of environmental regulations for decades, and he's requesting immediate condemnation proceedings." "On what grounds?" "Illegal storage of petroleum products, unauthorized modification of watershed, drainage, operation of heavy machinery without proper permits," Tom recited from a list. "All of it bureaucratic nonsense, but expensive to fight and designed to tie you up in legal proceedings until you run out of money." Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had accompanied his previous financial collapse. "How long do we have?" "County hearing is scheduled for next Friday," Colonel Morrison said. 1 week to prepare a defense against charges that have been in development for months. Hancock's been thorough." Frank Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of experience. "This is exactly what Raymond was afraid of. Hancock's using the system against itself, turning environmental protection laws into weapons for environmental destruction." "What can we do?" Eli asked quietly. Colonel Morrison opened a briefcase and extracted what appeared to be official military documentation. "Raymond's Medal of Honor creates several avenues for federal protection, but they require specific procedures to activate. The most powerful is designation as a national military heritage site, which would place the property under federal jurisdiction and override local development authority." "How do we get that designation?" The original 1925 Farmhouse tractor sat in the center of the county courthouse steps like a monument to American agricultural heritage, its restored red paint gleaming in the morning sunlight. Jack had insisted on bringing Raymond's first saved machine to the condemnation hearing, both as a symbol of what they were fighting to preserve and as a reminder that the worthless property contained treasures that couldn't be measured in dollars per acre. Eli sat in the operator's seat, wearing clean jeans and the dress shirt Martha Henderson had insisted he needed for court, looking like a young farmer from an earlier era. The sight drew curious looks from passers-by and provided exactly the kind of visual contrast Colonel Morrison had wanted. Heritage under threat from corporate greed, tradition standing firm against the forces of destruction. Media's arrived, Tom Brewster observed, nodding toward a cluster of news vans setting up equipment in the courthouse parking lot. Regional stations from Portland and Salem, plus somebody from CNN who flew in this morning. Jack felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the scope of attention their case had attracted. Colonel Morrison's media strategy had worked better than expected, framing their struggle as a David versus Goliath story that resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Rural voters saw an attack on agricultural heritage, environmental. Voters saw corporate destruction of conservation land. Military veterans saw disrespect for a Medal of Honor recipient's legacy. "Remember what we discussed," Morrison said quietly as they prepared to enter the courthouse. "This isn't just about our property anymore. Everything we say and do in there will be seen by people across the country who are fighting similar battles in their own communities." Harold Hancock arrived exactly at 9 o'clock, emerging from a black limousine flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like they'd been recruited from prestigious corporate firms. His entourage had the polished confidence of people accustomed to winning through superior resources rather than superior arguments. "Quite a show you've put on," Hancock said as he passed their group on the courthouse steps. "I hope you understand that none of this theater changes the fundamental legal issues involved. The fundamental issue is whether communities have the right to protect their heritage from corporate exploitation," Jack replied, loud enough for the nearby reporters to hear clearly. Hancock paused, clearly recognizing that their exchange was being recorded by multiple cameras. "Mr. Mercer, I'm simply trying to develop property in accordance with established legal procedures. If you've chosen to turn a routine zoning matter into a media circus, that's your decision." "Routine?" Martha Henderson stepped forward with the indignation of someone who'd watched 40 years of bureaucratic warfare. "You've been harassing landowners and manipulating local officials for decades. There's nothing routine about corporate bullying." The confrontation on the courthouse steps provided exactly the kind of footage that would dominate evening news broadcasts. But Jack found himself thinking less about media strategy and more about the man whose life work they were trying to protect. Raymond had spent 4 decades quietly building his preservation network, avoiding publicity and controversy whenever possible. Now his legacy was at the center of a very public battle that would have made him deeply uncomfortable. Inside the courthouse, the hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on video screens in adjacent rooms. Jack was surprised to see familiar faces from across the preservation network, farmers, veterans, historians, and collectors who'd driven hundreds of miles to show support for Raymond's mission. The county commissioners looked overwhelmed by the attention their routine hearing had attracted. Commissioner Patricia Wells, who served as board chair, opened the proceedings with obvious nervousness. "This hearing concerns alleged environmental and zoning violations at the former Raymond Mercer property," she announced. "We'll hear testimony from county staff regarding the violations, then from property owners regarding their response." The county's environmental compliance officer, a nervous man named David Foster, presented Hancock's allegations with the mechanical precision of someone reading from prepared talking points. Illegal petroleum storage, unpermitted modification of natural drainage, operation of heavy machinery without proper licensing. Each charge sounded serious when presented without context, designed to create an impression of environmental irresponsibility. "Mr. Foster," Jack's attorney interrupted during the presentation, "have you personally inspected the alleged violations?" Foster consulted his notes uncertainly. The inspection was conducted by authorized personnel from Hancock Environmental Services, acting as contractors for the county. So Harold Hancock's company conducted the inspection that resulted in charges against Mr. Mercer's property. That's standard procedure for complex environmental assessments. The admission drew murmurs from the packed hearing room and provided exactly the kind of conflict of interest angle that Colonel Morrison had predicted they'd find. Hancock hadn't just been pressuring Jack to sell, he'd been manipulating the regulatory process to create justification for condemnation proceedings. When Jack's turn came to present their defense, he walked to the podium carrying Raymond's Medal of Honor certificate and the geological surveys that revealed the true motivation behind Hancock's development interest. "Commissioners," he began, "my uncle Raymond Mercer spent 43 years quietly preserving agricultural heritage that represents the foundation of American rural culture. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for extraordinary valor in combat, then spent his civilian life fighting a different kind of war against the forces that would destroy everything previous generations had built." Jack gestured toward the overflow crowd of supporters. "These people represent families, communities, and organizations across 7 states who've been part of my uncle's preservation network. They're here because they understand that what's happening to our property today could happen to their heritage sites tomorrow." He presented the geological surveys showing the mineral deposits beneath Raymond's land, then the correspondence proving that Hancock had been trying to acquire the property for extraction purposes since the 1980s. The pattern of harassment, bureaucratic manipulation, and environmental charges filed by Hancock's own contractors painted a clear picture of corporate abuse of regulatory authority. "This isn't about environmental compliance," Jack concluded. "This is about whether communities have the right to preserve what matters to them, or whether everything must eventually be sacrificed to corporate profit margins." Commissioner Wells called for a brief recess, during which Jack found himself surrounded by supporters offering encouragement and reporters asking for additional comment. Through the crowd, he could see Hancock conferring urgently with his legal team, clearly not having expected the depth of organized resistance they were facing. "How do you think it's going?" Eli asked quietly. Jack looked at his son, this 11-year-old boy who'd become his partner in preserving Raymond's legacy, and realized that regardless of the commissioner's decision, they'd already accomplished something important. The story of Raymond's preservation network was now national news. The tactics Hancock had been using against rural communities were now public knowledge. The question of agricultural heritage versus corporate development was now part of the broader American conversation about values and priorities. "I think Uncle Raymond would be proud of what we've done," Jack said. "Win or lose, we've made sure his story gets told." The Congressional Medal of Honor lay on the commissioner's table like a piece of evidence that changed everything about the case they thought they were hearing. Colonel Morrison had presented it with the ceremonial precision of someone who understood. The weight of military tradition, accompanied by documentation that transformed Raymond's property from a local zoning dispute into a matter of national heritage preservation. "Commissioners," Morrison said in the clear voice of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials, "Staff Sergeant Raymond James Mercer was awarded our nation's highest military honor for actions that saved the lives of 43 American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. The property you're considering for condemnation contains the lifetime work of a genuine American hero." Harold Hancock's legal team looked genuinely surprised by the military documentation, clearly not having anticipated that their environmental compliance strategy would collide with federal heritage protection laws. Jack watched their hurried conference with satisfaction, understanding for the first time that Raymond's secrecy about his military service had been strategic rather than modest. Commissioner Wells examined the Medal of Honor certificate with obvious reverence, passing it carefully to her colleagues as Morrison continued his presentation. "Federal law provides specific protections for properties with military heritage significance," Morrison explained, presenting additional documentation. "I've been authorized by the Department of Interior to inform this commission that designation proceedings for National Military Heritage Site status are already underway. Federal designation would place this property under federal jurisdiction and override local development authority." The packed hearing room erupted in applause, quickly gavelled to order by Commissioner Wells. But the damage to Hancock's case was already done. What had been presented as a routine environmental compliance matter was now revealed as an attack on military heritage protected by federal law. Hancock himself stepped to the podium with the controlled fury of someone whose carefully planned strategy had just collapsed. "Commissioners, we can't allow emotional manipulation to override legitimate environmental concerns," he said. "Mr. Mercer's military service, while commendable, doesn't excuse decades of violations that pose genuine risks to watershed safety and regulatory compliance." "Mr. Hancock," interrupted Commissioner James Wright, "are you aware that your company conducted the environmental assessment that resulted in these charges? Hancock Environmental Services is a properly licensed contractor." "That's not what I asked." "Are you aware that your development company contracted with your environmental company to assess property that your development company has been trying to acquire for 30 years? The question drew another round of murmurs from the audience and visibly flustered Hancock's legal team. Jack realized that the commissioners were beginning to understand the scope of manipulation they'd been subjected to. Furthermore, Commissioner Sarah Chen added, consulting documents that had been distributed during the recess, "County records show that similar charges have been filed against 11 other rural properties in the past 2 years, all of them assessed by Hancock Environmental Services, and all of them located over the same geological formation that contains valuable mineral deposits." Hancock's confident facade finally cracked. "Commissioner, I resent the implication that my business practices are anything other than completely legitimate." "Mr. Hancock," Commissioner Wells interrupted, "I think this commission needs to consider whether these proceedings represent environmental protection or environmental exploitation disguised as regulatory compliance." The tide of the hearing had turned so dramatically that Jack almost felt sorry for Hancock's position. Almost. Then he remembered the months of pressure, the bureaucratic harassment, the systematic attempt to destroy Raymond's 40-year mission through legal intimidation. Martha Henderson was called to testify about the broader pattern of corporate pressure against preservation efforts, providing documentation of similar tactics used against other rural communities across Oregon. Her testimony painted a picture of systematic abuse of regulatory authority, with environmental laws being weaponized to force sales that couldn't be achieved through legitimate market pressure. Harold Hancock represents everything that's wrong with how we've allowed corporate interests to dominate community values, Martha concluded. He uses our own environmental protection laws as weapons against the very people who've been stewarding the land for generations. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Commissioner Wells called for final statements from both sides. Hancock's attorney presented a technical legal argument about the primacy of environmental regulations over heritage considerations, but his words seemed hollow in the face of the military documentation and federal intervention. Jack returned to the podium for his final statement, carrying the leather-bound ledger that contained Raymond's personal stories about each machine in the collection. "Commissioners," he said, "my uncle's Medal of Honor proves his heroism in war, but this ledger proves his heroism in peace. For 4 decades, he fought to preserve pieces of American heritage that the world wanted to forget. Every tractor in his collection represents a family, a farm, a way of life that connected people to the land they worked and the food they grew." Jack opened the ledger to a random page and read aloud, "August 15th, 1973, Today I saved the old Alice Chalmers from the Peterson farm. Maria Peterson cried when we loaded it onto the trailer. She said it was the tractor her husband bought when they first came to America from Mexico, that he'd worked 16-hour days to pay it off, that it represented everything they'd sacrificed to build a better life for their children. He closed the ledger and looked directly at the commissioners. That's what we're really fighting about today. Not environmental regulations or zoning compliance, but whether America will preserve the stories and machines and heritage that connect us to the people who built this country. Harold Hancock sees dollar signs where my uncle saw legacy. I hope you'll choose to see what Uncle Raymond saw. The commissioners retired for deliberation, while the crowd waited in tense silence. Jack found himself surrounded by supporters, but his attention was focused on Eli, who sat quietly in the front row looking older than his 11 years. "Whatever happens," Jack told his son, "we've honored Uncle Raymond's memory. We've told his story and fought for his mission." "I think we've done more than that," Eli replied. "I think we've shown other people that it's possible to fight back." 30 minutes later, Commissioner Wells returned with a decision that would reshape not just their own future, but the broader question of community rights versus corporate development pressure. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence," she announced, "this commission finds that the environmental charges filed against the Mercer property appear to be part of a systematic abuse of regulatory authority designed to facilitate private development rather than protect environmental resources." The hearing room erupted in cheers that took several minutes to quiet. "Furthermore," Wells continued, "we find that the federal heritage protections associated with Staff Sergeant Raymond Mercer's Medal of Honor service create legal safeguards that override local development authority. This commission hereby dismisses all charges against the Mercer property and recommends that the county district attorney investigate possible violations of environmental law by Hancock Development Corporation." Harold Hancock stormed out of the hearing room, followed by his legal team, but Jack barely noticed. He was focused on the crowd of supporters who'd traveled hundreds of miles to defend Raymond's legacy, on the reporters who would carry their story to communities across the country facing similar challenges, on the 11-year-old boy who'd become his partner in something larger than either of them had imagined possible. Outside the courthouse, the 1925 Farmhouse tractor still sat on the steps like a red monument to American agricultural heritage. Eli climbed back into the operator's seat while photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers across the country. The boy and the tractor representing continuity between past and future, between preservation and progress. "We did it," Eli said quietly. "Uncle Raymond did it," Jack corrected. "We just helped him finish what he started." As they prepared for the drive home, Colonel Morrison approached with news that would ensure their victory was more than temporary. "Federal designation came through an hour ago," he reported. "The Mercer property is now officially designated as the Raymond James Mercer National Military Heritage Site, with permanent protection under federal law. Hancock can't touch it, and neither can any future developer." Jack looked back at the courthouse, at the crowd of supporters still celebrating their victory, at the reporters still conducting interviews about the broader implications of community resistance to corporate development pressure. Raymond's quiet 40-year mission had become a national symbol, proof that individual dedication and community support could prevail against overwhelming odds. The worthless farmhouse that everyone had mocked had become the foundation of the most significant grassroots preservation victory in Oregon history. More importantly, it had become home. 1 year later, the new sign at the entrance to their property read, "Mercer Heritage Tractor Museum, founded in memory of Raymond Mercer, preserver of America's agricultural legacy," in carved wooden letters that gleamed with fresh varnish. Jack stood beside it in the morning sunshine, watching a school bus from Salem discharge 30 excited fourth graders who would spend the day learning about the machines that had fed America for more than a century. The transformation had been remarkable. What Harold Hancock had dismissed as a worthless collection of old tractors had become one of Oregon's most popular educational destinations, attracting visitors from across the country who came to see living history demonstrated by machines that still worked exactly as they had decades earlier. "Dad, the documentary crew is here," Eli called from the farmhouse porch, where he'd been helping Martha Henderson prepare educational materials for the day's visitors. The PBS film crew had been working on their project for 6 months, documenting not just Raymond's collection, but the broader network of agricultural preservation efforts that had grown from his quiet mission. The documentary would air nationally in the fall, ensuring that Raymond's story reached audiences who might never visit Oregon, but could still learn from his example. Jack walked back toward the house, pausing to watch Tom Brewster demonstrate the operation of a 1940s combine harvester to a group of fascinated children. The old mechanic had become the museum's chief interpreter, his decades of experience bringing the machines to life for visitors who'd never seen farming equipment that required skill and patience rather than computer programming. The underground chamber had been expanded and properly climate-controlled, with professional lighting and interpretive displays that told the story of each machine alongside its original owners. The collection now included more than 200 restored tractors, with additional pieces being discovered regularly as Raymond's preservation network continued to reveal its scope. "The morning tour group is getting restless," Martha observed as Jack joined her on the porch. At 75, she'd become the museum's volunteer coordinator, managing educational programs with the organizational skills of someone who'd spent decades running community organizations. Jack smiled at her gentle complaint. The success of the Heritage Museum had created challenges Raymond never could have anticipated. Too many visitors, too much attention, too many requests for educational programs and research access. It was the kind of problem Jack was grateful to have. Eli emerged from the house carrying a clipboard and wearing the serious expression he brought to his responsibilities as the museum's youngest docent. At 12, he'd become something of a celebrity among agricultural preservation enthusiasts, featured in magazine articles and documentary films as the boy who'd discovered Raymond's hidden treasure. "The county extension office wants to schedule another school group for next week," Eli reported, and someone from the Smithsonian called about borrowing 3 tractors for a national exhibition on American agricultural history. Jack felt a surge of pride watching his son handle responsibilities that would have challenged many adults. The quiet, observant boy who'd discovered the hidden chamber had developed into a confident young man who could explain the significance of a 1925 Fordson tractor to visiting historians, or demonstrate proper operation of a 1950s hay baler to curious school children. "What do you think, partner?" Jack asked. "Ready for another day of showing off Uncle Raymond's collection?" "Always," Eli replied with the enthusiasm that had made him popular with visitors, who appreciated learning from someone close to their own age. The morning tour began, as always, with the story of Raymond's war service and his transition from military hero to agricultural preservationist. Jack had learned to tell the story in ways that connected with different audiences, emphasizing heritage for school groups, conservation for environmental visitors, resistance to corporate pressure for farming communities dealing with development. Threats. Staff Sergeant Raymond Mercer earned the Medal of Honor for saving 43 American soldiers during one of the most difficult battles of World War II, Jack explained to the assembled group. But he spent the next 40 years fighting a different kind of war to preserve the machines and the heritage that built rural America. The tour moved through the museum displays, with each restored tractor accompanied by documentation of its original owners and the role it had played in American agricultural development. Visitors could see not just the evolution of farm equipment technology, but the stories of the families who depended on these machines for their livelihoods. The highlight of every tour was the demonstration of Old Blue, the 1947 John Deere Model A that still ran exactly as it had when Raymond first saved it from the scrapyard. Ely had learned to operate the vintage tractor with the skill of someone who'd grown up around farm equipment, and his explanations of its operation never failed to impress visitors who'd never seen machinery that required actual skill to run properly. This tractor doesn't have power steering or air conditioning or GPS navigation, Eli explained to the assembled school group. The farmer had to know how to read the soil, how to adjust the implements, how to maintain the engine. It was a partnership between the person and the machine. After the morning tour, Jack found himself in Raymond's old workshop, now converted into a research library, where historians and collectors could access the detailed documentation Raymond had compiled over 4 decades. The leather-bound ledgers had been professionally preserved, their stories of individual machines and their owners now part of the academic record of American agricultural history. A knock on the workshop door interrupted his reading. He looked up to see Colonel Morrison, still sharp in his retirement and now serving as chairman of the museum's board of directors. "Thought you'd want to see this," Morrison said, handing Jack a letter bearing the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. Jack read the official notification with growing amazement. The Raymond James Mercer Heritage Museum had been selected as a National Center of Excellence for Agricultural Heritage Education, qualifying for federal grants that would support expansion of their educational programs and research facilities. "This is incredible," Jack said. "Raymond's collection is now officially recognized as a national treasure." "More than that," Morrison replied. "The museum is being used as a model for similar preservation efforts across the country. There are 12 other communities that have started heritage museums based on what you've built here." Jack thought about Raymond's quiet mission, about the man who'd spent 40 years anonymously saving machines that the world wanted to forget. His uncle's work had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, inspiring a national movement to preserve agricultural heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. "I wish he could see what grew from his collection," Jack said. "I think maybe he did see it," Morrison replied. "Why else would he have spent so much time documenting everything, building the network, creating legal protections? Raymond was planning for this future. He just needed the right people to make it happen." That evening, as the last visitors departed and the museum settled into quiet, Jack and Eli sat on the front porch of the farmhouse that had once seemed like exile, but now felt like exactly where they belonged. The property that everyone had, called worthless, had become the foundation of their new lives, providing not just shelter, but purpose and community and connection to something larger than themselves. The Congressional Medal of Honor lay on the commissioner's table like a piece of evidence that changed everything about the case they thought they were hearing. Colonel Morrison had presented it with the ceremonial precision of someone who understood. The weight of military tradition, accompanied by documentation that transformed Raymond's property from a local zoning dispute into a matter of national heritage preservation. "Commissioners," Morrison said in the clear voice of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials, "Staff Sergeant Raymond James Mercer was awarded our nation's highest military honor for actions that saved the lives of 43 American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. The property you're considering for condemnation contains the lifetime work of a genuine American hero." Harold Hancock's legal team looked genuinely surprised by the military documentation, clearly not having anticipated that their environmental compliance strategy would collide with federal heritage protection laws. Jack watched their hurried conference with satisfaction, understanding for the first time that Raymond's secrecy about his military service had been strategic rather than modest. Commissioner Wells examined the Medal of Honor certificate with obvious reverence. Passing. it carefully to her colleagues as Morrison continued his presentation. Federal law provides specific protections for properties with military heritage significance, Morrison explained, presenting additional documentation. I've been authorized by the Department of Interior to inform this commission that designation proceedings for National Military Heritage Site status are already underway. Federal designation would place this property under federal jurisdiction and override local development authority. The packed hearing room erupted in applause, quickly gavelled to order by Commissioner Wells. But the damage to Hancock's case was already done. What had been presented as a routine environmental compliance matter was now revealed as an attack on military heritage protected by federal law. Hancock himself stepped to the podium with the controlled fury of someone whose carefully planned strategy had just collapsed. Commissioners, we can't allow emotional manipulation to override legitimate environmental concerns, he said. Mr. Mercer's military service, while commendable, doesn't excuse decades of violations that pose genuine risks to watershed safety and regulatory compliance. Mr. Hancock, interrupted Commissioner James Wright, are you aware that your company conducted the environmental assessment that resulted in these charges? Hancock Environmental Services is a properly licensed contractor. That's not what I asked. Are you aware that your development company contracted with your environmental company to assess property that your development company has been trying to acquire for 30 years? The question drew another round of murmurs from the audience and visibly flustered Hancock's legal team. Jack realized that the commissioners were beginning to understand the scope of manipulation they'd been subjected to. Furthermore, Commissioner Sarah Chen added, consulting documents that had been distributed during the recess, county records show that similar charges have been filed against 11 other rural properties in the past 2 years, all of them assessed by Hancock Environmental Services, and all of them located over the same geological formation that contains valuable mineral deposits. Hancock's confident facade finally cracked. Commissioner, I resent the implication that my business practices are anything other than completely legitimate. Mr. Hancock, Commissioner Wells interrupted, I think this commission needs to consider whether these proceedings represent environmental protection or environmental exploitation disguised as regulatory compliance. The tide of the hearing had turned so dramatically that Jack almost felt sorry for Hancock's position. Almost. Then he remembered the months of pressure, the bureaucratic harassment, the systematic attempt to destroy Raymond's 40-year mission through legal intimidation. Martha Henderson was called to testify about the broader pattern of corporate pressure against preservation efforts, providing documentation of similar tactics used against other rural communities across Oregon. Her testimony painted a picture of systematic abuse of regulatory authority, with environmental laws being weaponized to force sales that couldn't be achieved through legitimate market pressure. Harold Hancock represents everything that's wrong with how we've allowed corporate interests to dominate community values, Martha concluded. He uses our own environmental protection laws as weapons against the very people who've been stewarding the land for generations. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Commissioner Wells called for final statements from both sides. Hancock's attorney presented a technical legal argument about the primacy of environmental regulations over heritage considerations, but his words seemed hollow in the face of the military documentation and federal intervention. Jack returned to the podium for his final statement, carrying the leather-bound ledger that contained Raymond's personal stories about each machine in the collection. Commissioners, he said, my uncle's Medal of Honor proves his heroism in war, but this ledger proves his heroism in peace. For 4 decades, he fought to preserve pieces of American heritage that the world wanted to forget. Every tractor in his collection represents a family, a farm, a way of life that connected people to the land they worked and the food they grew. Jack opened the ledger to a random page and read aloud, August 15th, 1973. Today I saved the old Alice Chalmers from the Peterson farm. Maria Peterson cried when we loaded it onto the trailer. She said it was the tractor her husband bought when they first came to America from Mexico, that he'd worked 16-hour days to pay it off, that it represented everything they'd sacrificed to build a better life for their children. He closed the ledger and looked directly at the commissioners. That's what we're really fighting about today. Not environmental regulations or zoning compliance, but whether America will preserve the stories and machines and heritage that connect us to the people who built this country. Harold Hancock sees dollar signs where my uncle saw legacy. I hope you'll choose to see what Uncle Raymond saw. The commissioners retired for deliberation, while the crowd waited in tense silence. Jack found himself surrounded by supporters, but his attention was focused on Eli, who sat quietly in the front row looking older than his 11 years. Whatever happens, Jack told his son, we've honored Uncle Raymond's memory. We've told his story and fought for his mission. I think we've done more than that, Eli replied. I think we've shown other people that it's possible to fight back. 30 minutes later, Commissioner Wells returned with a decision that would reshape not just their own future, but the broader question of community rights versus corporate development pressure. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, she announced, this commission finds that the environmental charges filed against the Mercer property appear to be part of a systematic abuse of regulatory authority designed to facilitate private development rather than protect environmental resources. The hearing room erupted in cheers that took several minutes to quiet. Furthermore, Wells continued, we find that the federal heritage protections associated with Staff Sergeant Raymond Mercer's Medal of Honor service create legal safeguards that override local development authority. This commission hereby dismisses all charges against the Mercer property and recommends that the county district attorney investigate possible violations of environmental law by Hancock Development Corporation. Harold Hancock stormed out of the hearing room, followed by his legal team, but Jack barely noticed. He was focused on the crowd of supporters who'd traveled hundreds of miles to defend Raymond's legacy, on the reporters who would carry their story to communities across the country facing similar challenges, on the 11-year-old boy who'd become his partner in something larger than either of them had imagined possible. Outside the courthouse, the 1925 Farmhouse tractor still sat on the steps like a red monument to American agricultural heritage. Eli climbed back into the operator's seat while photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers across the country. The boy and the tractor representing continuity between past and future, between preservation and progress. We did it, Eli said quietly. Uncle Raymond did it, Jack corrected. We just helped him finish what he started. As they prepared for the drive home, Colonel Morrison approached with news that would ensure their victory was more than temporary. Federal designation came through an hour ago, he reported. The Mercer property is now officially designated as the Raymond James Mercer National Military Heritage Site, with permanent protection under federal law. Hancock can't touch it, and neither can any future developer. Jack looked back at the courthouse, at the crowd of supporters still celebrating their victory, at the reporters still conducting interviews about the broader implications of community resistance to corporate development pressure. Raymond's quiet 40-year mission had become a national symbol, proof that individual dedication and community support could prevail against overwhelming odds. The worthless farmhouse that everyone had mocked had become the foundation of the most significant grassroots preservation victory in Oregon history. More importantly, it had become home. 1 year later, the new sign at the entrance to their property read, Mercer Heritage Tractor Museum, founded in memory of Raymond Mercer, preserver of America's agricultural legacy, in carved wooden letters that gleamed with fresh varnish. Jack stood beside it in the morning sunshine, watching a school bus from Salem discharge 30 excited fourth graders who would spend the day learning about the machines that had fed America for more than a century. The transformation had been remarkable. What Harold Hancock had dismissed as a worthless collection of old tractors had become one of Oregon's most popular educational destinations, attracting visitors from across the country who came to see living history demonstrated by machines that still worked exactly as they had decades earlier. "Dad, the documentary crew is here," Eli called from the farmhouse porch, where he'd been helping Martha Henderson prepare educational materials for the day's visitors. The PBS film crew had been working on their project for 6 months, documenting not just Raymond's collection, but the broader network of agricultural preservation efforts that had grown from his quiet mission. The documentary would air nationally in the fall, ensuring that Raymond's story reached audiences who might never visit Oregon, but could still learn from his example. Jack walked back toward the house, pausing to watch Tom Brewster demonstrate the operation of a 1940s combine harvester to a group of fascinated children. The old mechanic had become the museum's chief interpreter, his decades of experience bringing the machines to life for visitors who'd never seen farming equipment that required skill and patience rather than computer programming. The underground chamber had been expanded and properly climate-controlled, with professional lighting and interpretive displays that told the story of each machine alongside its original owners. The collection now included more than 200 restored tractors, with additional pieces being discovered regularly as Raymond's preservation network continued to reveal its scope. "The morning tour group is getting restless," Martha observed as Jack joined her on the porch. At 75, she'd become the museum's volunteer coordinator, managing educational programs with the organizational skills of someone who'd spent decades running community organizations. Jack smiled at her gentle complaint. The success of the Heritage Museum had created challenges Raymond never could have anticipated. Too many visitors, too much attention, too many requests for educational programs and research access. It was the kind of problem Jack was grateful to have. Eli emerged from the house carrying a clipboard and wearing the serious expression he brought to his responsibilities as the museum's youngest docent. At 12, he'd become something of a celebrity among agricultural preservation enthusiasts, featured in magazine articles and documentary films as the boy who discovered Raymond's hidden treasure. "The county extension office wants to schedule another school group for next week," Eli reported, and someone from the Smithsonian called about borrowing 3 tractors for a national exhibition on American agricultural history. Jack felt a surge of pride watching his son handle responsibilities that would have challenged many adults. The quiet, observant boy who discovered the hidden chamber had developed into a confident young man who could explain the significance of a 1925 Fordson tractor to visiting historians, or demonstrate proper operation of a 1950s hay baler to curious school children. "What do you think, partner?" Jack asked. "Ready for another day of showing off Uncle Raymond's collection?" "Always," Eli replied with the enthusiasm that had made him popular with visitors, who appreciated learning from someone close to their own age. The morning tour began, as always, with the story of Raymond's war service and his transition from military hero to agricultural preservationist. Jack had learned to tell the story in ways that connected with different audiences, emphasizing heritage for school groups, conservation for environmental visitors, resistance to corporate pressure for farming communities dealing with development. Threats. Staff Sergeant Raymond Mercer earned the Medal of Honor for saving 43 American soldiers during one of the most difficult battles of World War II, Jack explained to the assembled group. But he spent the next 40 years fighting a different kind of war to preserve the machines and the heritage that built rural America. The tour moved through the museum displays, with each restored tractor accompanied by documentation of its original owners and the role it had played in American agricultural development. Visitors could see not just the evolution of farm equipment technology, but the stories of the families who depended on these machines for their livelihoods. The highlight of every tour was the demonstration of Old Blue, the 1947 John Deere Model A that still ran exactly as it had when Raymond first saved it from the scrapyard. Ely had learned to operate the vintage tractor with the skill of someone who'd grown up around farm equipment, and his explanations of its operation never failed to impress visitors who'd never seen machinery that required actual skill to run properly. This tractor doesn't have power steering or air conditioning or GPS navigation, Ely explained to the assembled school group. The farmer had to know how to read the soil, how to adjust the implements, how to maintain the engine. It was a partnership between the person and the machine. After the morning tour, Jack found himself in Raymond's old workshop, now converted into a research library, where historians and collectors could access the detailed documentation Raymond had compiled over 4 decades. The leather-bound ledgers had been professionally preserved, their stories of individual machines and their owners now part of the academic record of American agricultural history. A knock on the workshop door interrupted his reading. He looked up to see Colonel Morrison, still sharp in his retirement and now serving as chairman of the museum's board of directors. "Thought you'd want to see this," Morrison said, handing Jack a letter bearing the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. Jack read the official notification with growing amazement. The Raymond James Mercer Heritage Museum had been selected as a National Center of Excellence for Agricultural Heritage Education, qualifying for federal grants that would support expansion of their educational programs and research facilities. "This is incredible," Jack said. "Raymond's collection is now officially recognized as a national treasure." "More than that," Morrison replied. "The museum is being used as a model for similar preservation efforts across the country. There are 12 other communities that have started heritage museums based on what you've built here." Jack thought about Raymond's quiet mission, about the man who'd spent 40 years anonymously saving machines that the world wanted to forget. His uncle's work had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, inspiring a national movement to preserve agricultural heritage that might otherwise have been lost forever. "I wish he could see what grew from his collection," Jack said. "I think maybe he did see it," Morrison replied. "Why else would he have spent so much time documenting everything, building the network, creating legal protections? Raymond was planning for this future. He just needed the right people to make it happen." That evening, as the last visitors departed and the museum settled into quiet, Jack and Ely sat on the front porch of the farmhouse that had once seemed like exile, but now felt like exactly where they belonged. The property that everyone had, called worthless, had become the foundation of their new lives, providing not just shelter, but purpose and community and connection to something larger than themselves. "Do you ever miss the city?" Ely asked. Jack considered the question while watching the sunset paint the Oregon hills in shades of gold and amber. A year ago, he'd been a failed businessman facing foreclosure, desperate enough to accept any kind of shelter. Now he was the director of a nationally recognized heritage museum, stewarding a collection that attracted visitors from around the world and supported educational programs that were being replicated in dozens of other communities. "Sometimes I miss the convenience," Jack admitted, "but I don't miss the feeling that nothing I did really mattered. Here, every day, we're taking care of something that connects people to their history, to the land, to the generations who came before them. Uncle Raymond would be proud of us, wouldn't he?" Jack looked at his son, at this remarkable young man who'd helped transform a hidden collection of old tractors into a thriving center for heritage education and community engagement. Eli had found his calling in preservation work, developing skills and knowledge that would serve him throughout his life while carrying forward Raymond's mission to future generations. "I think Uncle Raymond would be amazed by what we've built together," Jack said. "But mostly, I think he'd be happy that his tractors found people who understand why they matter." The barn swallow that had nested in their kitchen during those first difficult weeks called from somewhere in the growing darkness, and an owl answered from the edge of the forest that bordered their property. The sounds of the Oregon wilderness that had once felt alien now provided the comfortable soundtrack of home. Inside the farmhouse, Raymond's photograph still sat on the mantel, showing the young man who'd stood beside his first saved tractor, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his purpose. Jack had added other pictures over the year, images of the museum's opening day, of Eli demonstrating equipment operation to fascinated visitors, of the hundreds of volunteers who'd helped transform Raymond's private collection into a public treasure. The worthless property that Harold Hancock had coveted for its mineral deposits had become priceless for entirely different reasons. Not because of what could be extracted from beneath the soil, but because of what had been preserved above it, machines and stories and connections that linked past to present, tradition to progress, individual dreams to collective heritage. As Jack prepared for bed, he walked through the museum one final time, checking that everything was secure for the night. The tractors sat in their displays like sleeping guardians, each one representing not just mechanical achievement, but human aspiration, the desire to work the land productively, to build something lasting, to leave the world better than they'd found it. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new opportunities to share Raymond's story and demonstrate the enduring value of the machines he'd saved. School children would learn about agricultural history through hands-on experience with equipment their great-grandparents might have used. Historians would conduct research that would preserve knowledge for future generations. Families would discover connections to their own agricultural heritage that they'd never known existed. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the Oregon hills, Jack simply stood among the preserved tractors and felt the profound satisfaction of stewardship well done. The collection that Raymond had hidden away for 40 years was now teaching thousands of people annually about the heritage that had shaped America. The worthless farmhouse had become a beacon for communities across the country who were fighting to preserve their own pieces of disappearing history. Most importantly, the quiet mission that Raymond had pursued in solitude had become a shared endeavor that connected people across generations, geography, and background through their common appreciation for the machines and the values that had built rural America. Jack turned off the museum lights and walked back to the farmhouse, where Eli was already asleep and dreaming, perhaps, of the restoration projects they'd tackle tomorrow, or the visitors who would discover something meaningful in Raymond's preserved legacy. The barn swallow called once more from its nest in the kitchen, a sound that had once seemed like evidence of abandonment, but now felt like a blessing on the home they'd built from what everyone else had considered worthless. Sometimes, Jack had learned, the most valuable things in life were the ones that nobody else wanted, until someone with vision and dedication and just enough stubborn hope decided they were worth saving. Outside, the Oregon hills stretched away into darkness, sheltering other communities who might someday face their own battles between preservation and development, heritage and profit, the quiet values that build lasting communities and the loud pressures that tear them apart. But tonight, at least, Raymond's tractors were safe, his story was being told, and his legacy was growing in ways that a humble Medal of Honor recipient who'd spent his life quietly saving discarded farm equipment never could have imagined. The worthless had become priceless, and the forgotten had become unforgettable, and the end was really just the beginning of something even more beautiful than what had come before.